Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Nick and Joe Show. I'm Joe, he's Nick. I'm in Ottawa, he's not. And
No,
you
that's true, he's
are...
not.
I was just about to repeat myself. Talk about being redundant. Of course, we're here in Canada, when you're redundant, that just means you're repeating yourself. It doesn't mean you're being fired or laid off.
No.
Just
There
wanted to
is
clarify that,
threat,
Nick.
but
Just wanted to clarify that. When I say I'm redundant, that doesn't mean that Nick's firing me.
I can't fire you. You're the co-host. As much
Well-
your sure as mine, you could fire me.
I was on YouTube the other day, and I was watching an interview by Ozzy Osbourne, who was the heart and soul of Black Sabbath, and I was quite surprised to hear him talking about how the group fired him. So
They did, eh?
at one point in time, then they had a reunion, and that's the thing about these guys, right? It's sort of like,
Yeah.
how many times do you have a reunion? How many times do you have a sort of a goodbye tour? That's it, a goodbye tour. Anyway,
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because Queen went through the same thing. They didn't fire Freddie Mercury, but he went off on his own for about a year or so.
right?
And realized that even though he had some of the best musicians in the world, he went to Germany to do some recording. They did exactly what I told them to do. There was no pushback. There was no, well, what if we tried it this way? And he said, that's what made Queen great.
This is Freddie Mercury. You're
I'm
referring
talking
to
about.
Freddie Mercury telling
Right.
them exactly what to do. You're not
Right.
not you, Nick Vandergraat.
I wish. I might have a reasonable paycheck. Anyway, but no, he made the comment. And I'm sure that Ozzy would have the same kind of. It's when some of these super bands and groups and organizations, it's a sum of they're the individual pieces. How do I put it? There's a saying. The organization is greater.
The whole is greater than the sum of its parts.
That's it. I knew if I worked on it long enough,
I knew you would. I knew you'd get it, Nick.
Beat the crap out of that old saying. Anyway, and he proved that to himself, and they went on for more success. And then, of course, we all know what happened in the end. Anyway, so Ozzy Osbourne, I was never a Black Sabbath fan. I never liked them. But I respected Ozzy Osbourne. He was a very bright man and very highly skilled musician.
And doped out of his mind normally.
He was like Keith Richards.
We would play. We used to play organized broomball, and it's funny. We had it was just a pickup league, and we would play in the old Aberdeen Pavilion, the Cattle Castle at Lansdowne Park in Ottawa,
right,
on Sunday mornings. And the reason that we played there is because there was no heat in the building in the winter time, so it was easy to put up a rink in there. And so you were playing indoors, but it was always colder by about 10 degrees indoors because the sun couldn't get there, right? So they had set up this rink in there, and just a very quick aside, it was the two things that we had the most trouble with the cold in the Aberdeen Pavilion was first of all, the balls that you use in broom ball would freeze, and so you'd have to have 4 or 5 of them because if you wound up and took a big shot, it's often the ball would shatter. So that was the first problem. And the second problem was that every now and then a pigeon would fall from the rafters frozen to death. So we'd have to wear helmets on the ice, not to protect ourselves from falling and hitting the ice with our head, but rather having
From
frozen pigeons fall
pigeons
down on
dropping
top
on
of
your
us.
head.
But anyway,
Yeah.
what does this have to do with Black Sabbath? Well, what we would do is our team went 2 years undefeated. And our team warm up was that we come out of the dressing room and we'd be playing someone who would have an old ghetto blaster going back about, I guess, 40 years now.
Yeah.
And someone would be playing Black Sabbath Iron Man full blast, and we all go on the ice, and then we'd line up, and someone would go 1, 2, 3, and then we'd run into the boards. And we did that 2 or 3 times, and of course we won the games before we even started, right? Because people were just very intimidated by us.
Intimidation is a
So that's
powerful
my
thing.
Black Sabbath. I wasn't a real Black Sabbath fan, but
Right.
that's my Black Sabbath story.
Yep.
Um,
Now, speaking of stories,
yeah. So, one of the things that's going on out there right now, Nick, is food insecurity. And I know you have some polling data
yep,
from taken here. I believe it's in Canada
yep,
that indicates just how people are feeling about their ability to feed their families, and the numbers are quite shocking. I think. Why don't you give them over to us?
sure. I've got the article right here. This is from Post Millennial News, and the headline reads: "The majority of excuse me." Anyway, I'm cutting my throat. Majority of Canadians worried about feeding their families. 53% of Canadians surveyed in a new poll are fearful about not being able to put food on the table, an increase of 9 points in just the last month. I'll share a couple of paragraphs from the story, from the body of the story. Canadians are increasingly concerned about their finances amid the soaring inflation, with the majority anxious about whether they'll be able to afford to feed their families, a new Ipsos poll conducted exclusively for Global News indicates. The poll shows that 53% of people surveyed are fearful about not being able to put food on the table, an increase of 9 points in just the last month. It's quite a startling statistic, said Sean Simpson, Senior Vice President of Ipsos Public Affairs. I could go on, and if people want to read the whole article, just go to Post Millennial News. It's there, and you can read it. There's not a lot more to it, but that's as far as I want to go with it right now. The bottom line here is this is how do I put this? Food security is one of the things that a nation must have in order to consider itself sovereign. Food, energy, and military security. Those things. So you got to be able to secure the borders. You got to be able to feed your people. You got to be able to keep them warm so they don't freeze to death in the wintertime, in Canada at least. Those are the three things, and all those three things have been undermined and attacked. Certainly in the last half a decade, if not in some cases much longer than that. Look at the military. I mean, it's, where are we now compared to where we were 20 years ago or 30 years ago or 40 years ago? Draw your line in the sand wherever you want to. So it's remarkable that when you think about it, and when you compare this to what's going on over in Holland, I'm wondering if what the Trudeau government is planning, where they want to dramatically reduce the amount of nitrogen being put into the soil under the guise of, climate change. They want to reduce nitrogen, put nitrogen back in the oxygen, back in the atmosphere. That's where it comes from in the first place. So you're not degrading the atmosphere by taking the nitrogen out. If you release it back to the atmosphere, you're just putting back on the shelf, so to speak. And in Holland, the story goes, and I have it from the BBC right here, we have a situation where the Dutch government is planning on shutting down 3,000 farms. 3,000. Now, Holland's not that big, okay? But it is one of the most agriculturally prolific countries in the world. There are no better farmers in the world than Dutchmen. And I'm not saying that because I'm Dutch. I'm saying that because in Holland, they have to be good at it because they don't have much land to work with. Blast it. Anyway, so they're out there, and the whole reason they're giving is the fact that they want to cut down on emissions. They want to meet their climate goals, and they're going after one of those fundamental institutions that supports a nation, and that is its food supply. If you shut 3,000 farms down in the most productive agricultural country in the world, albeit it's set aside its size, that's going to have a dramatic impact on the Dutch people's ability to feed themselves. So when you look at that and you look at this, what's going on here in Canada with the reduction of the nitrogen fertilizer being allowed to be used on farms, we're lining up for the same thing. How are we going to have any kind of food security if we don't have the ability to feed ourselves? And when you look at what's going on in Southeast Asia, in some of those countries down there where there's been food riots, where governments have been toppled because their rice crops collapsed. Well, that's the staple. It's like corn here in North America. Rice is the same thing in a large chunk of the world. Okay. You can't just shut those things down and expect to have no consequences. People have to eat. And if you want to inspire somebody to get, I don't want to say, if you want to inspire violence, let's put it that way, that's a good way to do it. You make people go hungry. And when they have to look at their kids and they know that the government's doing this and there's no good reason for it, there's no war going on, there's no rationing. Like if you look at some of the calamities of the past where there's been blockades and food shortages. I'm thinking of Britain during World War II and Germany during the same period, World War One, where the people couldn't be fed because there wasn't enough local production to be able to feed them and their military at the same time. This is not the case here. You just have this massive effort around the world to reduce the amount of food available. And I don't want to sound like some tin hat conspiracy theorist, but tell me, look at it and come to another conclusion. And it's not, sooner or later, you got to call a spade a spade. Why are they doing this? I don't know. I can't read minds. I don't know what goes on behind closed doors, but I can see what the results are. And the results are when you take nitrogen-based fertilizer away from the agricultural industry as we know it today, people are going to starve. And that's what the bottom line is.
Well, I think that it's a multi-layered issue. I'm not really worried about people starving. I will say this: shutting down 3,000 farms in Holland will impact the amount of food, obviously, that's being produced. But Holland is a net exporter of food, and so the Dutch people are not going to starve because 3,000 farms get shut down. So I think that I think it's really important, for the sake of having an important, this is an important topic, and if we're going to have a conversation around it, then we have to be careful not to exaggerate the threat. So nobody in Holland is going to starve, and even in Canada, and nobody's going to starve because of all of this. What it may end up doing is we may end up, for whatever reason, reducing the amount of food that we or the Dutch or any other country that's doing this, we may end up reducing the amount of food that's exported. And so it is possible that in certain places that rely on Canadian or Dutch or other jurisdictions exporting food to those jurisdictions or those areas, that they're going to suffer, which is a serious enough problem. But
now,
you and I aren't going to starve.
Okay, let me throw this into the mix. In Holland, I just Googled it. There's 12,000 farms in Holland.
Right.
You shut down 3,000 of them. That's 25%.
Yes.
That's a big chunk.
No question about it. I'm not.
So to put it into
issue
perspective, I guess is what I'm trying to do.
No, it is. It's a lot, and it's going to have an impact. But where it's going to have the most impact I think, and this is where we get, especially in government these days, trying to do everything and trying to control everything, that they end up taking policies that conflict with one another. And so here's the thing, Nick, is we're in the middle of an inflationary period. And I think that the fact that food prices are going up is contributing to the idea that I don't know how I'm going to be able to feed my family. It's not just the idea that there's not going to be food available. I think that most people are not thinking that way. I think most people who would have answered that survey would be saying, I'm having difficulty making ends meet. I don't know how I'm going to be able to afford to continue to feed my family in the way that I've been feeding them all along. Now, that's just speculation on my part, but I suspect that a large part of that is of the insecurity that's being expressed in this poll comes from inflation. But here's the thing: is that, again, we these guys on the left don't seem to understand that the rules of economics apply even when you try to control them by government policy. Okay, so you can't really control economics. All you could do is interfere with them, and what you do on one hand is going to have an impact somewhere else. So here's the thing about reducing food production for whatever reason. The result of that is going to be a reduction in the amount of food, and that's going to increase pricing because you have a scarcity. And scarcity not meaning that there's not enough to go around and therefore, but scarcity meaning there's less. Less food, more people eating equals higher prices for food. Bottom line.
But
So
the
if you're
point,
worried about inflation, as people are worried about inflation, and if the government is truly concerned about the rising cost of food, then taking measures that are going to reduce the production of food is exactly the opposite of what you should be doing. Now, just to touch on the question of why are they doing it? Well, I take them at face value. They said that they're doing it because of climate change. And I think that's just an absurd thing to do. Because look, here's the thing is they want to reduce the amount of nitrogen based fertilizer that's being used. And
Mhm.
so they're going to stop this production, or they're going to regulate the production and use of nitrogen based fertilizer. But here is the Dairy Farmers Association running commercials. I haven't seen these on TV. I don't watch TV, but I do see them from time to time on the internet, talking about how they're going to move to net zero, okay, by doing what? Using manure, okay, cow droppings as fertilizer in their fields,
Okay, well,
grazing. And I'm thinking to myself, well, there are two problems with that. Problems, not really problems, okay? But I have two things to say about that. The first thing is there's nothing new about using fertilizer, spreading fertilizer, manure as fertilizer. That's been a standard for generations and generations and generations. We do it
absolutely.
every spring. So this is not a new thing. Why they're talking about it being new, I don't know, or some sort of a new campaign. But what is the main nutrient included in fertilizer?
Look, I get you. You're right. It's nitrogen. And this you're also right. Farmers of every kind, cattle, pigs, chickens, you name it, the droppings these animals produce, the fertilizer, the manure that they produce, goes
Well,
there's
yeah,
nitrogen,
it's
right?
nitrogen. Nitrogen is the main nutrient in cow manure, in cow
Yeah,
droppings.
okay.
So
But
what do you? So that's the first thing, and then the second thing about this is that, as you've already alluded to, Nick, is that the nitrogen that you're using in nitrogen-based fertilizers, even if they're so-called chemical, okay, is actually taken out of the atmosphere in the first
that's where we get
place.
it from.
That's where you get it from.
But
So,
the point, what I'm trying to say though, Joseph, is in areas where you don't have a lot of animal-based agriculture. Take the prairies, the breadbasket, okay? In Alberta,
yeah,
Saskatchewan, Manitoba, okay? Those huge wheat fields, those huge canola fields, corn fields.
Right.
There aren't enough cattle around, horses,
Yeah,
pigs,
I
and other
understand that.
animals to make. That's why they use this artificial fertilizer,
Right. So
and
so
that's
what
why
I
our crop yields are so high.
okay, so what'll end up happening is this: you stop using these artificial fertilizers. We'll use that term, okay?
Yeah.
And the yield goes down, and so we have less yield. So what that will do, nobody in Canada is going to starve because of this. We produce far more food in this country than we use. We're a net exporter of food. There are some things that we don't have in terms of fresh vegetables and fruits during the winter months, but all of that is those problems are surmountable problems. Okay, the issue is not are we going to starve. The issue is, are we going to create a shortage of food production that is going to put a great deal of upward pressure on the price of food? And this is the point I'm making, is that you create, and by the way, let me stress, just Nick, let me just stress, I am not defending government action here. Okay,
Oh, I'm not
I am
suggesting you are.
no, but just in case anyone's misunderstanding what I'm saying here, okay, I'm not saying the government should get away with doing these reductions or anything. Okay, I think it's just bonkers, but I think it's a good illustration of how a government can take on a policy that's going to have a dramatic and opposite effect to what they want it to have. Well, not in this case. They want it to reduce climate change, but it's only going to exacerbate greatly food inflation. So
Well,
it's this is the thing that bothers me about it, is it's like
yeah.
the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Okay. Well, let me address a couple of points I've seen in the chat room. Tara says, "Why can't we truck in manure?" And it's not because her answer is, "I know we have pollution from the commute, the actual transportation of the manure." That's a small part. The real reason is we have far more land than we have manure. Like,
Correct.
just fly over the country and you'll realize how intensive dairy and cattle and chicken and other livestock farming would have to be to replace artificial fertilizer that are now being spread on those fields out in the prairies. We just don't have enough of it.
Right.
Unless we started digging up Parliament Hill, then we'd have plenty. But they're not going to let us
Right.
doing that.
And
Uh,
that's not so much manure as hot air anyway.
you want to talk stock? You want to stop climate change? That's how you do it.
Well, global
Take those
warming,
guys out of
remember now,
business.
nobody talks about global warming anymore. It's all climate change now. By the way, Nick, on that, have you been following the story about this rogue wave? A rogue wave that hit a cruise ship in just south of Argentina,
Oh,
between the Argentina and Antarctica,
yeah.
and one of the passengers died. So anyway, I was reading that people are saying that this is all due to climate change, and they were talking about
What?
17-meter waves and stuff like that, and I'm thinking, you guys haven't been in the North Atlantic in the winter time. Oh my goodness gracious. He's going, wow, 5-story waves. How could that possibly be?
Well,
And I'm
that is
going,
a
yeah, okay.
60-foot wave. That's not
Eh,
small. But
no, I get it. I get it. Okay. But I'm just saying, yeah, that's not because of climate change, guys.
no, rogue waves have been around since men put boats to sea. As a
Sure.
matter of fact, probably long before that. They just, at a certain point, the rhythm of the ocean produces them. It has nothing to do with the climate. So it's just funny how people who don't know anything about, and I'm no hydrologist or oceanographer. I just was a guy who spent 10 years out there, and I don't think we ever did see a rogue wave, but they're not unheard of,
No,
and that
of
has
course not.
nothing to do with the climate. There was something else. First of all, I want to welcome Tara to the chat room. She's from southeastern Ontario.
Hey,
It's nice
Tara.
to have her on the show, and she's calling from a corner of the world, and because it's smaller, and there are a lot of animal farms in that corner of the province. But I don't know, Tara, if you've ever gone across the country, drive across the country. Like I live on the northwest, in the northwestern corner of Ontario. I've been to Winnipeg a bunch of times. I've been to Calgary. I've been to BC, and trust me, there are millions and millions of acres out there. Most of it farmed, and I tell you what, it's why, as
Yeah.
John posted a graphic earlier, that we ship 6.1 million, I think it was million metric tons, million metric tons of durum wheat to 49 different countries. So yeah, we do ship a lot of grain overseas, but the question becomes, because Joseph, you're cutting more slack than I do. Why? Surely they understand, the people who want to push this climate change, at the highest levels. They understand the consequences of this, yet they do it anyway.
Yeah, Nick,
And that's the part that bothers me.
I'm just not prepared to concede that point. Call it Occam's razor, okay? Don't
Okay.
don't assume that these guys know what they're talking about.
Are you referring to
And
don't explain don't assign a conspiracy what can be explained by stupidity?
that's it exactly. And in fairness, let's not call it stupidity. Let's call it just ignorance. And people become so narrow in their education, their specialties, that they don't consider or understand the implications of what they're doing in one area on other areas. It's and this is a classic example. Is okay. I don't agree with the policies that are being adopted in order to combat quote unquote climate change. Okay, I think that they're all very silly about what they're doing about this. But let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that climate change is real and that we have to take measures in order to mitigate it, okay, to slow it down, whatever. But you have to understand that these particular measures are going to have a dramatic impact on economic issues at exactly the time that we're trying to stop the problems that we're having in economics, namely inflation. So,
Well,
and I don't accept that the people in the climate change side of things, who already I think have problematic education, I don't think they think of or understand the economic implications of what they're doing.
I just want to make one point. When you're talking about climate change, it's not that when you said, I don't believe in climate change, you don't believe that we are causing climate change. Climate
Right, right,
changes
right.
all the time. Just for the
Exactly. Yes.
listeners out there who might be new to the show, we're not denying climate change.
No,
That's
of
been
course
going
not.
on since the beginning of the planet.
Yeah.
Nobody's arguing that. We're arguing about whether or not we have any impact on it. And I vehemently, and I think Joseph will agree with me, say absolutely not. Certainly
Well,
not on the scale that we're being told.
right. That's. I'm glad you clarified that, because I'm not going to say that we don't have an impact on climate change. But look, I was reading the other day about everybody being up in arms in Europe about a particular glacier. I don't recall where it was, that possibly might be gone in the next 25 or 30 years. Okay. And I'm thinking, yeah, and people are worried about this as if it's a dramatic change. And I'm thinking, yeah, well, you know how big those glaciers were 30,000 years ago? Okay. It's you know what it's if all of the glaciers melt and disappear in the next 25 or 30 years or 50 years, okay, it does not represent in any way, shape, or form a dramatic change in our climate, because these glaciers have been disappearing all along. Gosh, we strayed from talking about what they're talking about doing in Holland, about buying out and
Yeah, but
closing
it's all
farms,
kind of
to climate change.
interwoven,
But
though.
yeah, it's all part of the same stew, as you like to
Right.
say, Nick.
That's why they called it Greenland, Marin, because it was green. They used to grow grapes there.
Absolutely.
All right. With that said, I believe it's time to take our first break. So, what we'll do is we'll duck out. And if you want to refill your glass, go right ahead. We'll be back with more on the Nick and Joe Show right after this.
We all know that climate change is real. But with countries like China and India failing to do their part, what Canadians need now more than ever is a Made in Canada climate change plan. A real plan that responds to the real-world needs of Canadians. A balanced plan that supports responsible economic growth and strengthens our essential infrastructure. A responsible plan that protects our natural environment and ensures that all Canadians enjoy the blessings of clean air, clean land, and clean water for generations to come. It's time for Canadian politicians to show real leadership in the world, putting partisanship and ideology aside. It's time for a sensible climate plan. We're the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and we're ready to help. To learn more, visit our website, icsc-canada.com.
Kind of a catchy tune. Welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show, folks. I'm Nick. He's Joseph. He's in the nation's capital down there in Ottawa, and I'm not. Up here in the northwest corner in Sioux Lookout, it was almost minus 40. Not last night, night before. But it's supposed to get back up almost the freezing mark here Tuesday, I think. So,
minus 40?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Minus 40 is cold.
Yep. But you know what? People up here are adapted to it. Everybody's got lots of really good cold weather clothing. And you know that it's only going to last 10 months out of the year. So, you hope for those two. I'm being a little silly, but the bottom line is that in the wintertime when it gets cold up here, it gets cold. But you get used to it. It's not a wet cold like you get down around the Great Lakes or out on the oceans. Anyway,
all right. We got a call.
Yeah. Let's see. Next up, we have, again, coming to us from Post-Millennial News, a story.
No, Nick, slow down. We got a call. We got a phone
we
call
do?
here.
Oh, good Lord. Bring it on.
Hello.
Hey, Hudson, how you doing?
Pretty good. How are y'all doing?
Oh, we're having a blast. I feel like a one-legged frog in a pond full of pike. Highly motivated.
Yeah. That's
yeah,
awesome.
Listen, Hudson, I got to tell you, Nick rehearses those in front of his mirror.
Hey, it's
My
working very
monitor,
well.
actually.
So,
Yeah. So what's going on with Hudson tonight?
nothing much. Just got finished reading the 48 Rules of Power. So that was a pretty good book. I would definitely recommend it.
I haven't heard of it. Who's the author?
So it's by Robert Greene. It's a book that goes through history and shows example of how different people grab power throughout history. And what caught my attention because it's banned in all U.S. prisons because the prisoners would because there's a part of it where it shows you how to reverse how to grab power, and it teaches people how to manipulate others. So it's banned in prisons because the prisoners would use it to manipulate the guards.
Maybe that's not such a bad idea. I thought it was kind of funny at first, but maybe if I was a guard, I don't know if I'd want them playing, Star Wars mind tricks on my feeble little brain.
Oh yeah, 100%. And then I was hearing y'all talking earlier about climate change, and I think one big problem, especially in the U.S. school systems, is how teachers are pushing their political agenda onto students instead of teaching a biased narrative. I mean, it doesn't even have to be a history class. In my English class, our teacher blames climate control for just about everything. And, it's very frustrating, especially because it's just such a radical opinion.
Yeah, and it's not unique to the United States either. We have the same problem up here. We've got people who are, using the classroom as a bully pulpit to force their world agenda on very malleable young minds.
But they believe
all they
should
be doing is what they're paid to do.
Right. But the problem that we really have is that they genuinely believe what they're teaching. And it's not like they're coming in and they're thinking, okay, what are we going to do to take over the planet? Okay, it's they actually, and this is a great challenge for those of us who are more conservative and more common sense oriented. Okay, and dare I say, have a better basic education. Is that we constantly we're up against people who are in the classrooms who believe sincerely that what they're doing is saving the planet. And those of us who are going, whoa, just slow down, are actually endangering the planet. They are true believers, which makes them very dangerous. And it makes our job that much more difficult because it's so much more difficult to convince them that they're actually wrong. And they don't have the skills, they don't have the basic education to actually understand that the stuff that they're spewing out there is not, it's just not right. It's scientifically wrong.
Right, I absolutely agree. I mean, if anything, we should have a political education class where it shows you how to read both sides and then realize that the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. It's not going to be all far left or far right. Usually they both twist it a little bit. I mean, you got to find a just in the middle. I mean, it's really a struggle though, because like you said, young minds are very moldable, especially when parents have different political beliefs and they don't want their kids to be pushed what they don't believe, and then they come home with these ideas and the parents have to argue with their kids. It just creates turmoil in the home.
Yeah, it does.
Right.
And have you ever seen George Carlin's "What's Wrong with the" bit about the planet?
I have not.
Look that up on YouTube. It's not only is it funny, he nails it about how what threat we are to the planet. I won't tell you any more about
Well,
it.
there,
Just go look it up on YouTube and watch it.
there is a certain amount of hubris involved in this belief that somehow or other we are predominantly responsible for everything that happens in the planet, and everything good and everything bad. And I'm not saying we don't have an effect, and sometimes our effect can be quite serious, quite profound, but the reality is that for the most part, what we do doesn't really have that big of an impact. But what's his name? The United Nations. Who's the chair of the UN right now? The
I used to know. I can't tell you right now.
Can't remember Gelti. I want to say
Is it
Galtieri, but it's not
I
Guterres or
can't
whatever his
pronounce it. I
name
think it
is. I
starts
can't
with
remember.
C though, the chair of the UN.
Yeah. So anyway,
It's
he's
like
in Montreal this past week and giving a speech about the international protect our ecology conference. Now it's and Justin Trudeau, our prime minister, talks about how we're going to take measures to ensure that 30% of our nature is preserved in Canada. I'm going, okay, you putz. I think what is it? 5% of our country is developed. So you're promising we're going to save 30%. 95% of the country is already underdeveloped. It's like how you and he flies across the country from time to time. Maybe he shouldn't be partying on his private jet. Maybe he should be watching out the window and seeing exactly how much development there is in this country. We are a terribly underdeveloped, underpopulated country, for
Well,
better or worse. But
let me
here's the
jump in
head
here
of the
for a second.
UN. Here's the head of the UN giving a speech talking about how human beings are the what was the word he used, or the term he used? I don't have it in front of me, but um, uh, causing extinction for everything, and we are the masters of extinction. There was a term he used that employed extinction, and I'm going, extinction. Like no species has ever gone extinct before human beings were walking the planet. Okay,
Except for
or
the
anything like that.
95% of them that aren't alive anymore.
I know it's just it's nonsense. But of course, nobody knows. Okay, Hudson, we have. Sorry to. I know you have something to say, but let me just make this
oh,
point.
absolutely. Go
Okay,
ahead,
we
please.
we have we have Nick and I have talked about this before as well. When we talk about climate change, okay, and what have you, and I try to tell people, the glaciers that you are worried about disappearing. Here I am in Ottawa. We used to be under like 2.5 kilometers, a mile or thereabouts, of glacial ice. And there's a whole geological formation in Ontario that's called the Canadian Shield that was caused by receding glaciers. Okay. So if you actually, now this kind of thing used to be taught in grade school geography. If
Mhm.
you know this, you know that melting glaciers are not a problem. They're perfectly natural. And we're at the end period of a glacial retreat. Okay. That's the way the whole thing works. But my cell phone is going off here repeatedly. There we go.
Yeah, Chris is quite
Sorry.
right about the Great Lakes, for example. Yeah, that's a good point. That's where they came from.
I
So
mean,
what's on your mind, Hudson? What did you want to share?
I
We,
mean,
we
that's,
are going to get to that point.
I just kind of wanted to come in and see what y'all were talking about and kind of add on to
Okay.
it, especially with the climate change, because I
Well,
feel like it's a problem for some people, and the rest of people just don't care whatsoever.
yeah,
Like,
there's the thing that tipped me off when I first heard about this, and it's just that I remember biology from school. When they told me that carbon dioxide gas was the cause of the problem, I knew this whole thing was nonsense because carbon dioxide gas is not pollution, it is plant food. And if we get too good at removing it, all of us will die. And yet everybody's freaking out about 400 parts per million, or thereabouts. And yet in greenhouses, they run it up to 1,200, 1,500 parts per million because the plants do better. So it was all nonsense. And that's what really tipped it off for me. So when I run into a young person and they start, usually they're young because they haven't had the benefit of being taught this stuff in school. When they start going off about how the planet's going to crash and we're the problem, you just ask them that. What exactly is carbon dioxide gas? Well, that's the greenhouse gas is going to kill us. No, it's not. It's plant food. And they look at you like you
Well,
got three heads.
it's not just plant food. It's you produce carbon dioxide. That's when
Every time
you
you exhale.
exhale. It's
That's right.
so. In fact, it's funny because that was one of the funny things that I used to tell people when they were talking about their masks. Right, the minute they started talking during the COVID stuff, the minute they started talking about carbon dioxide being a pollution, I pointed out to them, well, then you can't get people to wear masks because they're poisoning themselves by rebreathing their own carbon dioxide. Right, so it's. Make up your minds, guys. It's either pollution or it's not pollution, and of course, it's not. But it's just nonsense.
I think there's a very simple solution to the emissions that could kind of solve everything. I think it's nuclear energy, to be honest with you,
Yes,
because that is it takes up minimal space, supplies jobs, steady source of energy. It's very friendly to the environment, but it powers a lot more than oil and coal, and all it take very minimal time to set up and get everything going.
Well, I
yeah,
think this is part of the reason why I don't think climate change was ever about the climate. I think it was about power and money and control. Because any logical, reasonable person, even if they didn't know the first thing about biology, would have to agree with that. Now, there are some issues that come with nuclear power, but there isn't an energy source out there that I know of that doesn't have an issue that comes with it. But if it's either nuclear power or high efficiency incineration of our garbage, talk about solving two problems at once, nobody's interested in these things. Well, like, I don't know about where you live, but we haven't started a new power plant, the construction of a new nuclear power plant in what, 40 years?
Oh, well, we've actually denuclearizing. A lot of countries are now. Everyone's taking, for instance, France, their main power source used to be nuclear energy, and now they're actually switching away from that for who knows why. I mean, some of these plants had a decade left of life on them that could have easily continued operational. And the last meltdown was decades ago, and it was from old technology.
Yeah.
The chance of a meltdown happening now is slim to none.
Well, everybody thinks Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island, right?
I mean, yeah, but
well,
you can't compare the Stone Age to the medieval age. I mean,
Yeah,
so
but
much has
people
happened
do.
over that time. I mean, the thing
Pe-
is, if we keep doing that, then we're never going to be able to advance because we're always going to be scared of the past.
well, look at incineration. If you want to talk about how people have a certain mindset about something, modern incineration produces air coming out of it that's cleaner than what goes in. Not only that, but you extract the energy the garbage contains, you turn it into steam, you're on a turbine, you're on a generator, and you have pretty cheap power instead of the solar and wind stuff, which is really expensive and unreliable. But
I mean,
people think when they hear incineration, 1970s smoke belching out the top of a chimney, acid rain, and all that stuff.
I think another big issue is we're focusing on stuff like clean energy before we're, I mean, but there's multiple wars going on right now with hundreds of thousands of people dying. We're doing nothing about that. Instead of we're sending billions of dollars into research into a new wind turbine, instead we can put that money into, you know, anything that could help. It,
Yes, Tara, that is what Denmark does. They're one of the few countries that actually, in Vienna, the center of town, is a colleague of mine or an ex-colleague of mine who used to have a show right here on Blast Radio, Lowell Green. He would preach about that and go over it for over a decade. So yes, that is certainly true of Denmark. But yeah, you're right about the Hudson, about pouring money into areas where you're not going to get the kind of bang for your buck that you really could. Look at, even if we just dammed a few more rivers. Like if you ever fly over Northwestern or across Ontario or the country or just a continent and look at the rivers and say, okay, what's more important? You know, making sure the black nosed dace survives, a little minnow, or cheap energy for millions of people. Which one matters more? Well, a lot of people will say, well, that little minnow, we're going to drive it to extinction, which we won't because it'll just find another way to survive. So, anyway, there's
yeah.
all kinds of issues you can get into following that thread.
Well, I feel like the reason why all this is happening at the end of the day is politics. That's just as simple as that. The politicians don't really care about making big advances when they can make small advances and make money along the way. It's really just a very corrupt system in almost every country you look in. And I think if we can, kind of flush out all the corruptness, our world would advance so much faster.
Well,
Couldn't agree with you more.
I don't want to sound like a left wing lunatic or anything like that, but I will say this: there's a lot of big money in green energy, and that's really what's driving a lot of this now. Corporations moving over to green energy, including, by the way, some of the biggest corporations now that are into green energy and green energy research are the big oil companies. And I'm not against the big oil companies. Don't get me wrong, but when the government starts handing out money like candy, nobody should be surprised when people, including especially perhaps big business, actually go out and with their hands out and say, "Yeah, give me some of that. I'm happy to take it from you, and even if I don't believe it, I'm happy to go along with what you're saying and keep to the talking points as long as the money keeps flowing in." So there's the money that's circulating in the whole green energy industry is really almost inconceivable, and it's just out there for people to take. So they take it, and that's a big thing driving the whole thing as well.
Yeah. Well, look at Ontario this week, just announced $200 million for an electric car plant here in Ontario. The whole cost is $500 million. So they're opening an electric car plant. Half of it's paid for, or almost half of it's paid for. You know what, Marin? That's a great saying. Greed energy. Absolutely. But anyway, to get back to this, the Ford and Trudeau announced $200 million of public money going into building this thing. Instead of letting the market drive if the public wants it, then they'll pay for it. That's true. That's an economic truth that's over and over again. And this is why I don't like the government messing in the marketplace.
I mean,
That's yeah. So
um,
anyway,
one thing that's, sorry for interrupting, by the way, but one thing that's really terrifying, I don't know if y'all saw, but the Defense Department has failed an audit, and the 3.5 trillion in assets they have, 61% of its assets couldn't be accounted for.
61% of 3.1 trillion.
So that's literally trillions of dollars that are just they don't know where it is. 1,600 auditors looked at that. I mean, you can look it up. It's on the hill.com, but it's absolutely absurd
Yes.
that, how do you lose track of trillions of dollars? That is just, and no one's going to find it either. It's just kind of, oh, you failed, do better next time. No one's
Well,
actually looking to where this went.
this is a lot different than just losing a truck on our Canadian artillery range when you come up to mess around with the Canadian artillery. That's an old story out of Petawawa down in the Ottawa Valley. There's a big base there where we use our M777s for practice, and the American unit came up and left a 5.5-ton truck behind. And about 3 years later, some officer came up looking for it. This is not the same thing. This is not the same category at all. I mean, how do you lose $1.5 trillion? Where does
Oh,
it go? Like, there's got to be hardware somewhere with U.S. military stamped on it.
Yeah, it's I suspect that I haven't seen the report, and I suspect that there's a lot more detail to it than
Of
that.
course.
Because as you say, it's not very easy to lose that kind of not be able to account for those kinds of assets. So it sounds to me probably that there's some accounting issues involved as well.
You can build
But
aircraft carriers for that kind of money.
well, yeah, several.
That's right.
Well, I don't know about several, but a few anyway. But look,
Couple at least.
there's no question that probably the least efficient branch of government is the military, and there's only so much. This is a problem actually generally with government again, and another argument for small government, and that is because you keep on hearing politicians that want to get elected, and they'll come to you and they'll say, "Well, we're going to cut spending. How are you going to cut spending?" Well, we're going to cut spending by finding greater efficiency. But the bigger government is, the less efficient it is. And there's only so much efficiency that you can get out of government. And here's my classic illustration. If you have one community that has 1,000 people with an average income of $25,000, and right next to it you have another community, or let's say you have a city with two neighborhoods, half of the city has an income of $25,000 dollars. The other half of the city has an income of $75,000. Okay, $25,000 is not a lot of money. $75,000 is enough to get by on. Okay, what's the average income of the of that city? Well, if you have a basic education, which so many people these days seem to lack, you would know that the average is $50,000. How many people make $50,000 a year in that city? The answer is nobody. So if you're a government bureaucrat and you're designing some sort of an aid package for that city and you're working on averages, you're going to target an average of $50,000 for the average income or mean income. But of course, very few people actually have an average income, so you design your program to deal with a range of incomes. And in this case, the range would be between $25,000 and $75,000, or maybe you'd compress it a little bit to get closer to the mean. But the point is that by design, whatever program you're putting together is going to be inefficient. It's not going to be narrowly targeted to the people that you want to help. And that's the nature of the beast. If you want to save money in government, you can't do it by efficiency. There's some fat that you can cut out, but you have to cut programs. There's no two ways about that. So any politician that says, I'm going to save real money, but I'm going to do it by finding efficiencies, they're either yanking your chain or they just don't know what they're talking about, which again is a real problem these days in government.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, but the one argument for the having a big government, which I've have a very weird view where I think that certain parts of the government should be big, but then they should butt out of certain sectors. I mean, obviously the economy should be a freelance economy. The government business should self-regulate themselves. Of course, there should be minimum, wage and stuff like that, but nothing absurd. But I believe that, as a U.S. citizen standpoint, we do need a big military solely because
That's
without
fair.
big military presence, a lot of the countries that are kind of holding back right now would not hold back anymore. But I think in some aspects, some of these companies that are getting bailed out on a daily basis do not need to be bailed out. Some
Yeah.
companies, I agree, do need to be bailed out. Some pharmaceutical companies need to be bailed out so we can create better medicine and not have that as a competitive market. But, if a food company goes under, let them go under. If a bank goes under, let them go under. There's
Right.
certain companies that we should not bail out, and there's certain companies we should.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
and
that's
let me
not
stress,
weird.
I don't disagree with you on that, Hudson. That's why I always tell people I'm not anti-government. I'm a conservative, not a libertarian. I see that there's a role for government, and in some cases, maybe there's a role for bigger government. But it all depends on the context. It all depends on the time, the place, and what the purpose is. But it has to be practical. There has to be a real need for it, and there has to be you have to have a situation where it's not creating more problems than you're solving. But yeah, I don't disagree with you on that.
And I don't think that's weird at all. I think that's actually pretty practical because you're right. Every country needs, especially in Canada, we could certainly use a doubling of the size of our military, given the size of our geography and our NATO commitments. So, and to double it, that's not you're going from 80,000 people to 160. You guys have more than that in a National Guard. So now, mind you, your country's 10 times the size, in population than ours is. But at the same time, if we want to pull our own weight, we could certainly use that. So I don't hear anything weird or unusual in your point of view. I think that you've pretty much nailed a very good point to stand on with what you had to say.
I mean, you would think that it's not weird, but I mean, until you start talking to other people and then all of a sudden, you're a radical for thinking, pretty moderate things, then you realize that there's people nowadays, especially in our two-party system, there's pretty much only there's very few moderates, and as time's been going on, the less and less moderates there are because less and less moderates get voted in. So to be able to be in office, you have to be radical.
Well, just remember, you're not the radical one. They are. With that, how are we doing? I think it's time to take a break. Have we got any more time, or are we all out, John?
We're getting close.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Listen, Hudson, anytime. You give us a call whenever you feel like it.
Yes, sir. Thank you, guys. Have a good night.
All right. Have a good night.
Thanks for calling, Hudson.
Yeah, we were going to get into the whole gun thing. I guess we'll have to push that into the next segment.
Right.
Gun control and the Montreal Massacre and all that stuff. We'll have to do that in the next segment. So you guys stick around. We've got plenty more straight ahead. It's the Nick and Joe Show. We'll be right back after this.
Who says you can't turn the clock back? Experience the excitement of open-air flying and see Canada's national capital region like you've never seen it before from the open cockpit of a vintage 1930s biplane. Are you up for the adventure? Put on your helmet and goggles and strap yourself in. Book your flight today. Go to OttawaBiplaneAdventures.com. That's OttawaBiplaneAdventures.com. Ottawa Biplane Adventures. The adventure begins here.
Oh my gosh, that was so exciting! I gotta do it again.
Welcome back to the Nick and Joe Show. I am Joe, and as per usual, he should be Nick, but he obviously has just stepped away from his camera for a minute or two.
I'm back.
And now he is back. Welcome back to the show, Nick.
Yep. I need to make
That's
a
okay.
bio break.
We don't need to know about that.
Like nobody else does that, right?
Well,
Anyway,
no, everybody does, but nobody talks about it on national radio with the frequency that you do, Nick. And I suspect that
hey,
it's more
listen,
than just the frequency that you have to do it.
Greg Gutfeld talks about poop all the time.
Yeah, well, how do I put this delicately? You're not Greg Gutfeld.
That's not delicate, but that is accurate. I'm taller than he is.
Yeah. You could
Anyway,
have. Here's the thing about Greg is that if he loses a couple of thousand viewers because of his humor,
yeah,
he doesn't care.
that's true. If I lose a couple thousand, that would be a big deal.
We should be so lucky as to have a couple of thousand that we're in the position to lose.
Well, there is that also. Now, one of the things that we did want to get into to get
Yeah,
back to being a little bit serious. Let me just close a couple of these windows I have open here so we can get to what matters. All right. Now, there is a story over on our favorite website, Post Millennial. And given that yesterday was the anniversary of the Montreal massacre, where Marc Lépine walked through that university in Montreal and shot 14 women and injured 13 more, killed 14 women and injured 13 more. Certainly a horrific event. And a lot of that has been used as that particular incident has been used as a catalyst for a lot demanding more and more gun control. Somebody sent me a piece. I was going to post it, and I just haven't gotten a chance to do it yet, about the different gun control measures since 1900 and how each one was put into place, and we the people who own firearms complied, and it made no difference to the kind of violence that we were seeing. So this is another one of those events. It propelled things like the gun registry and all that sort of thing. And under no circumstances do I want anybody to think that I'm diminishing the horror of what happened 33 years ago. I'm not saying that in any way, shape, or form. That was disgusting. It was brutal. It was horrific. All of those adjectives fit this event. Now, but as far as gun control goes in this country, everything they've tried has failed. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, Justin Trudeau is passing more gun control laws aimed at centerfire rifles that hunters and duck hunters and people who, farmers and people like that, target shooters who are not a threat to anybody. They don't have any reason to be. These are law-abiding citizens vetted by the RCMP. They have all the licenses and gone through all the safety courses and all that stuff. And yet he thinks they're unsafe. So he's taking 1,500 different firearms, making them prohibited or you can't own them. Anyway, so with that in mind, we have this story. 57 of 62 guns seized in Toronto police sting were smuggled in from the United States. Over 60 firearms destined for street sale were seized during an investigation of alleged arms traffickers, the Toronto Police Service said in a statement released on Monday. Investigators seized 62 firearms, the major being Glock handguns worth up to $6,000 in street value. I'm taking they mean a piece. Following an 8-month-long operation titled Project Barbell. 3 AK-style weapons and 5 AR-15-style rifles were also seized, police said. Of the guns, 57 were traced back to the United States. One was stolen in an Ontario break and enter, while others were untraceable. Okay, so what that really boils down to is that whatever Trudeau is planning, whatever he wants to do with this latest round of gun control has already failed. It's not going to work, okay, because nothing else that they've put in place has reduced the crime. As a matter of fact, it always gets worse because the more you make citizens unable to defend themselves, the more it is that people who will use guns to commit crime feel free to use them, especially when you have a justice system that is based on a turnstile, catch and release. They don't have the kind of penalties. Instead of having a law in the books that says if you use a firearm, any firearm, we don't care whether it's a 22 caliber single shot pistol or whether it's an AK-47, if you use it in the commission of a crime, then you are going to jail for 10 years without parole, and then we'll worry about the rest of the crime, the assault and battery and all the other things, all the rest of it. But you're going to go to jail for at least 10 years if you use a firearm in the commission of crime. Instead of doing that, oh no, there's all kinds of plea deals. There's all kinds of things going on. Catch and release, people released on their own recognizance and all kinds of nasty stuff going on. And they wonder why it gets worse. They're not targeting the right group. They should be going after people who smuggle guns, people who use guns in gang violence, not duck hunters, not deer hunters, and not people who want to poke little holes in pieces of paper 100 yards away.
So, as we discussed the last time this subject came up, I just think it's just important for the sake of clarity to remember that the amendment to the current bill before Parliament on gun regulations is not a government amendment. And my understanding is that the government probably is not going to support it. And which leads me actually to wonder whether or not it was a poison pill or, a straw man amendment in the first place, that you have somebody put this in so that there's this great outcry, and now Trudeau could come forward and say, yeah, well, we're not actually doing that. We are protecting the rights of hunters and farmers, etc. I don't know. I wouldn't, from a strategic point of view, I probably wouldn't put that past the government. Not that I'm saying that if I was in their shoes, I would do it. I probably wouldn't, but it's been done before, and I suspect that maybe there's an element of that now. That said, there's nothing that I can argue with on the points that you've made, Nick. Okay, first things first, this particular gun seizure in Toronto, almost all of the weapons that were seized, not all of them, but almost all of them, were in fact handguns. And handguns are already prohibited. And in any case, okay, they're all illegal handguns, which means they're doubly prohibited, if you want to take the term doubly prohibited. Okay, so, making them triply prohibited isn't going to make a difference. Gun control, we even have a problem when we talk about this, because I think the terminology maybe isn't the right terminology to use, because we're not really, gun regulation, gun control, I don't know. Somehow or other we've equated gun control with a reduction in gun violence. And that's just not the case. It's like saying car control we have car control as a way of making sure that nobody speeds, or nobody parks illegally, or nobody makes a right-hand turn without signaling first. There's something wrong with the way even we who are on the other side of this argument, we tend to buy into certain things. Okay, so I don't know what they're trying to do when they talk about gun control, other than discourage the ownership and use of guns, legal or illegal. But I will say this: I know what gun control doesn't do. It's not going to stop gun violence. Okay, it may, we have to be careful. I'm making a pretty universal, pretty general statement. Maybe, theoretically, and who can ever prove a negative, maybe if you have certain gun laws, it may prevent, in one case or two cases or in sporadic cases, it may somehow or other, a gun didn't end up in that person's hand because there are fewer guns and regulations are tighter about them. And if the gun had ended up in that person's hands, then maybe we would have had a problem, okay? Is that possible? Who can say it's impossible? I certainly can't. But as a general policy, gun control does not reduce gun violence. Okay? If you want to stop gun violence, you have to go after the people who are using guns for violent purposes. And they're not using legal guns, they're using illegal guns to start with.
Well, first of all, even I find it interesting where, earlier in the show you said, well, I'll take them at face value when you talked about what their intentions are. And I find myself saying the same thing in this case. I'll take them at face value. They think that people with shotguns and rifles. I mean, where I live, a lot of people use firearms. We have trappers, we have native people, we have a lot of people who aren't native but live in the area who count on being able to go out and hunt and fish to put some extra protein in the freezer, especially now that the price of food is climbing ever higher. People are moose hunting, they're deer hunting, they're duck hunting, they're partridge hunting, they're fishing for walleye and bass and all these other things because it's expensive to feed yourself out of the marketplace. So what he's doing is by making those weapons restricted or almost impossible to use. Now, as I mentioned last week or maybe the week before, in a lot of cases, I don't know, in a lot of cases, in some cases at least, most of the guys that I know who hunt the big game, they'll have a 5-round clip, but the rifle will be bolt action. Some use a semi-automatic, but they never fire it more than 1 round at a time, because if you have to fire 2 shots, you missed the first time, and now you're chasing the animal, and you don't want to do that. So these guys have scopes. They're very good shots, and most of the time the kill is clean and fast, and the meat is absolutely pristine. It's why, and they just enjoy being outdoors. But he's limiting their ability to do that, because who is he to decide whether to use a semi-auto or a bolt action? So there's a lot to this. There's a lot of facets to it. And when I hear him stand up and say, well, we're going to make 1,500 firearms either prohibited or just outright ban them, I didn't even know there were that many kinds. I mean, I know a fair amount about firearms, but I didn't know there were that many. I know there's, a handful of manufacturers and they all have their own product line, but 1,500? What does that leave us with? So anyway, that's why I'll take him at face value on this one. I think he fully intends to try to make things as miserable as possible for people who actually use firearms like a tool.
Yeah, but Nick,
if you've ever tried, sorry.
If you're taking him at face value, then taking him at face value means that you believe him when he says that they don't want to ban long guns that hunters.
But his legislation doesn't say that.
But okay, so yeah, but that's where you have to be careful and make sure that we know what the legislation is actually calling for. And this is he has in the last week. Gosh, why are you putting me in a position where I'm defending this man? Because I don't want to be defending him, okay? But we have to deal with the real situation. And the real situation is that this backbench MP a couple of weeks ago introduced an amendment to the legislation that included all of these rifles that we were talking about, or guns we were talking about a week ago or 2 weeks ago. Okay, but that's not a government amendment. And in the past week, he's already said, no, we're not going to do that. So that's a pretty strong indication to me that they're going to kill the amendment. All right. So, I mean, if they kill the amendment, that's great. So, if you have your bolt action, whatever it is, Nick, it's probably not going to be touched by this particular latest piece of legislation.
I just don't like the idea they would even consider it.
Fair enough. But the people that are considering this stuff don't have experience with, they don't know what they're talking about. And so
that part is obvious.
Right. So look, the problem here again is I'm speaking personally now, okay? I don't want to get dragged into should this gun be banned or that gun be banned or whatever, okay? Because for me, it's a pointless discussion. The issue is not what guns we're going to ban. The issue should be, if we're really serious, if we want to really show that we're serious about saving lives, okay, then what we should be doing is, and we should, if we're concerned about law and order, then let's not argue about what guns should be banned or not banned, okay? Let's flip the liberal agenda on its head and say, okay, you guys want to do something about gun violence in Toronto? Put the people who use guns in the commission of a crime in jail and keep them in jail, okay? And if I was the gun lobby, and I'm not, they're not asking me for my opinion, so okay, it's, but it's our show, so I get to give my opinion on just about anything I want, right, Nick? Well,
That's
here's
right.
my opinion. Stop arguing about the details of this legislation and call it out for what it is, all right? It's a red herring. You guys want to deal with gun violence in the city of Toronto? So do I. Put the criminals in jail and keep them in jail.
All right. On that, I will agree with you.
Okay? And because nobody cares. The average person doesn't care whether it's a center shot or a rim shot. All they're doing is they're going, what does basketball have to do with this?
Yeah, you're right. Most
Okay,
people think Hollywood is a good source of information about firearms.
If you look at polling on this, and I don't have any data to bring up to reinforce what I'm saying, but if you look at polling on this, I think you'll find that this is a battle that we're losing. We're losing this battle in the court of public opinion, okay? And that's because we're not I think we're not paying close enough attention to the motivation or the alleged motivation of supporters of this kind of bill who don't understand why anyone would be against this, because we have to do something about gun violence in Toronto. Now, again, I think that's the wrong position for them to take, but I understand it. And again, just like climate change, we talked about this before the show, just like the question of climate change, we're up against people who don't know what they're talking about, but want to pursue this because they believe it's the right thing to do. And when it comes to this kind of thing, how can you argue that taking measures to reduce gun violence in Toronto, how can you argue that that's a bad thing to do? So we're not, as supporters of the firearms industry, as supporters of hunters or hunters ourselves, or as supporters of target shooters or whatever, okay, law-abiding gun owners. We're making a mistake because we're allowing the argument to be over the guns rather than providing a viable, sensible, sellable alternative to the liberal gun control agenda in order to achieve the objectives that they want to achieve, which is reduce or even eliminate gun violence in the city of Toronto or on our urban streets.
Joseph, if I ever get elected prime minister, you will be my gun czar.
Because well, sure, and why? I unfortunately I won't be a very good czar because I won't bother with gun control. Because
that's
gun
why
control,
I pick you.
It's
We
gun.
just start repealing some of these stupid laws and start putting laws on the books that actually put people in jail for using these things.
Yeah, gun control is not the solution to gun violence. People control is.
That's probably as succinct a way to put it as anything.
Or let me fine tune that, okay? Criminal control is, okay? Don't control the tools, control the people using the tools.
Well, you know what? Criminals are people too, whether we like it or not.
and here's the best part about this is, okay, the peripheral benefit, okay, of doing this will be great as well. Because typically the guys that are doing the gun violence, okay, they're the gang members that are selling drugs illegally and they're doing all of the other bad stuff. So when you take them off the street, you're reducing crime in a whole way on areas that have Nothing to do with guns. Nothing to
Well,
do with firearms.
isn't that what Mayor Giuliani did in New York?
It's
He went
essentially
after side
it's
jumpers on the subway and
well the
found out they
theory
were responsible for 90% of the crime.
well the theory was that if you get them, if you intervene early, that is to say you charge them, arrest them, charge them, and punish them when they're doing the small stuff, then they're not going to start doing the big stuff. So for petty things, petty vandalism, jumping turnstiles in the subway,
Right.
graffiti writing, things like that. That was the crime that they concentrated on, and when they were dealing with that, as they reduced those crimes, they found that the more serious crimes went down, even though they didn't have a campaign to reduce the more serious crimes. And the theory being that you start off as a petty criminal and you work your way up. It's a fascinating theory, and by all accounts, it worked quite well in New York City. Um,
Well, until recently,
well, because
New York
they've
is,
reduced it, they've reversed it altogether.
yeah,
And
that's
now,
what I mean.
I remember when I first went to New York in the 70s. It was a place where there were lots of places that I would never have dreamed of going. And then, in the late 80s into the 90s and that, there was no place in New York that I would avoid going. No neighborhood that I would say, oh, can't go there. Now it's sort of going back to the way it was before. It's
Yeah,
unfortunate, especially for the people who live there. But
isn't
it's
that
not as
true?
safe a place as it was 20 years ago. That's for sure.
Hey, that is absolutely. I remember being there in the '80s with the when I was in the Navy. We pulled alongside, and even then it was a little seedy. In the downtown core. Well, New York's so big. Where's the downtown
Right,
core,
right,
right?
right.
But in the section that we were in, uh, you had
Uh,
to. You didn't go ashore by yourself. You went
Well,
as a group.
and isn't it interesting, Nick, that sailors end up going to the places where you don't want to go by yourself?
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty
What's
much
up with
true of
that?
every port of call I've ever been in.
Yeah, what's up with that?
Someday I'll
Yeah,
tell you the Amsterdam stories, but I won't do that tonight.
but
Oh,
look. The bottom line is this, okay, Nick, is I think, and I'm speaking again here a little bit off topic, okay, but it is related, and that is to say that uh, sometimes the way we oppose the policies of the liberals, okay, and not just the liberal government, the liberal policies, isn't necessarily very wise, because so much of what they want to do, so many of their policies are predicated on, frankly, the best of intentions. Okay, so for instance, you have state-run universal health care. Okay, well, you have the government having a monopoly in Canada on health care. So what we need to do is we need to stop talking about the economics of healthcare, and we need to focus on the fact that people are not getting healthcare. Period.
yeah.
And so the problem here with the healthcare system in this country is that it's not actually helping people, okay, except in certain exceptional circumstances where maybe government run health insurance isn't such a bad thing. But we focus on the minutia of the policy, and we criticize the policy rather than spending time pointing out that we agree with the objective of the
Premise.
policy.
Yeah.
The problem is the policy isn't meeting that objective. Now, again, it's easy for me to say this, all right, and I am generalizing. So some people could come back and be critical of what I'm saying. Fine, I get it, but this is the whole argument on gun control. It's the whole argument on climate change. It's the whole argument in so many areas. Okay, is the people that support these policies, the people who come up with these policies, aren't evil people trying to take over your life. Okay, they're good people who are just wrong in their approach to solving the problems that they look at and they think that they need to solve.
Well,
That's the biggest. That's the biggest problem we have.
Human nature is when you see these kind of things, and I will admit I fall prey to it once in a while myself. That when someone has an opposing view that you see as really damaging, it's easy to see that as bad, or I don't want to go so far as to say evil, but that they must be, there's something wrong with them. That how could they even think this way? Forgetting the fact that there's more than one way, to use that old analogy of skinning a cat, right?
Right.
So I hear what you're saying about that we have to step back a little more often and say, okay, what really matters here? What's the bigger picture? And instead of burying ourselves in the minutia of a particular thing, like take climate change as an example, we can beat our chest all we want and say CO2 is plant food, not pollution. But unless you have an audience educated well enough, and I don't mean that they're ignorant, I mean that part of their education is lacking, then you're wasting your time. You have to find another way to skin that cat, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, except I would be careful using that terminology on our show, Nick, because you might be getting people to start thinking about knife control.
Oh, brother. Every time I hear that phrase, I think of that poor guy in Scotland who got arrested for carrying a potato peeler in his pocket.
Well, that's when knife violence is out of control, regulate
the potato
knives.
Peeler's got to go.
Yeah. The
Just
potato peeler's got to go.
Yeah.
We could probably
England's
make that
a mess
into some
from that
sort of
point
a
of view.
rhyme.
when we'll think of something clever. Anyway, I just want to kind of tease people a little bit because we don't have time to dive into it in any depth this segment, but we'll probably get into it. But there's a story. But longbows are too easy to make. And by easy, I don't mean easy, but they're a lot easier. And you've got people wouldn't use longbows now anyway. They go for compound bows, crossbows, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So if on the longbow thing, on the bows thing
in
altogether,
general,
what you want to be careful about, what you want to pay attention to, is the feet per second, okay, of the projectile, because that's where they'll get you. Eventually, if that's the direction they're going to go, they're going to get you on the speed of the projectile.
You know how you could thwart that? Get good with a sling. I'm serious.
I can still do
ancient armies.
I could still regulate slings and slingshots and that on speed of projectile if I want to go lower.
Says Alexander the Great. And he didn't even let them carry snare wire.
Surely I thought you'd bring up David and Goliath.
Well, that's where I was going with that till you mentioned, because David only took one stone, smooth, flat one, and
just
game
remember,
over.
those slings kill too.
Slings, and we were joke about it, but if you think about it, in ancient armies, slingers were some of the most important people, because you don't have to stand there and whip it around your head. You just have to get the velocity on it. And if you were a good slinger, you could pick a bird out of the air, and you could, you had the range of a bow, and dropping rocks that weigh 3-4 ounces from however far away, moving it how fast, hit a guy in the forehead or in the thigh or in the knee, all of a sudden he's incapacitated. Yes, Kirk is right. Yamamoto thought it was a bad idea to invade the United States because his quote was, "There will be a rifle behind every blade of grass." I believe it was something like that. Speaking of him, we're going to talk about that in the next segment as well. What I was going to tease people with was there is a story you want to talk about a Canadian Paralympian who is also a former military member, and what advice they gave her about how to deal with her impatience about getting a lift, an in-home chairlift.
But for that, you have to stay tuned.
That's right. That's as far as I'm going with that, because we need to take a break. We'll be right back with more on the Nick and Joe Show right after this.
Tune into the next segment.
Right. Yes. Good idea.
Okay. All right.
All right. We'll be right back.
We all know that climate change is real. But with countries like China and India failing to do their part, what Canadians need now more than ever is a Made in Canada climate change plan. A real plan that responds to the real-world needs of Canadians. A balanced plan that supports responsible economic growth and strengthens our essential infrastructure. A responsible plan that protects our natural environment and ensures that all Canadians enjoy the blessings of clean air, clean land, and clean water for generations to come. It's time for Canadian politicians to show real leadership in the world, putting partisanship and ideology aside. It's time for a sensible climate plan. We're the International Climate Science Coalition Canada, and we're ready to help. To learn more, visit our website, icsc-canada.com.
All right, welcome back to. Are we on? Okay, we're back. All right. I just saw the screen come up and wondered what happened. Anyway, we were teasing you earlier with, and by tease, I mean that teasing the story and keep you interested. There is this story that comes to us. It's a Canadian story. Let me just give you the headline. Canadian Paralympian and a veteran offered suicide by Trudeau government after asking for in-home chairlift. Now, here's the quote that she claims was made to her. Now, this is an allegation, so let's keep that in mind. Madam, if you really are so desperate, we can give you medical assistance in dying now. Paralympian Christine Gauthier reportedly was told by a Veterans Affairs Canada caseworker. All right, here's a little bit of the body of the story. A disabled and retired Canadian Army corporal and former Paralympian Christian Gauthier testified on Thursday before Parliament that a caseworker from Veterans Affairs Canada suggested she consider medically assisted suicide, otherwise known as death, instead of waiting for a wheelchair lift to be installed in her home. She said she could not believe the VAC would give me an injection to help me die, but you will not give me the tools I need to help me live. Gauthier requested a chairlift from the VAC in 2017. VAC is short form for Veterans Affairs Canada. Not having one has isolated me greatly because I have to crawl down my butt with the wheel. Crawl down. That's not written very well. Crawl down my butt with a wheelchair in front of me. I think she meant on my butt. With the wheelchair in front of me to be able to access my house. She kept up the request to the VAC until 2019, when Gauthier said her caseworker told her, Madam, if you're really so desperate, we can give you medical assistance in dying now. All right. This story, what do you say? I mean, is human life so cheap now that when serving somebody who has served us, worn our uniform, okay, I don't know why she's disabled, whether it was in service or not, but she's now disabled, is a Paralympian, someone who went and competed in an Olympic event and won. I don't know if she actually won anything, but she certainly competed on the world stage, carrying our flag. It says to them, it's been 2 years, lady. I mean, come on. Why don't you just die? In essence, that's what was said. So I'm running out of adjectives to describe this kind of thing because to me, it's so horrific. Human life is so unvaluable now. It's so cheap and disposable that when anybody just gets fed up with you, they say, yeah, just die. Let me just give you this shot of Pentothal and it's all over and you won't have to worry about anything. All your pain will be gone, which really translates into all my frustrations dealing with you will be gone. Because I'm not doing my job. I'm not getting you what you need, and I don't feel like doing it. How else do you explain this? And Joseph, I don't know about you, but this is I don't want to overuse the word horrific, but it's completely unacceptable. It's completely appalling that anyone would think to treat one of ours who wore our uniform, performed for us on the world stage as Olympian, is treated this. You know what? It wouldn't matter whether they were in uniform or not, Olympic medalist or not. Anybody would have this suggestion made to them when all they want is a way to continue to live their life the best of their ability. That's not help.
Unless that's how you define help, which is, of course, the way things seem to be going in our society these days. Nick, you started out by telling us that this was a Canadian story, but really it's not just a Canadian story. It's a cautionary story for other countries as they move closer and closer to accepting, embracing this whole concept of assisted suicide. I like to say, forget about dying with dignity and let's find a way to help people live with dignity.
I
It
like
just
that.
seems
Yep.
it just seems to me that the whole assisted suicide movement, okay, is it's all about, dare I say, laziness. It's about society throwing in the towel and saying, we can't help you. We can't give you a helping hand up. We can't work with you. We can't support you. We can't do any of these things. And therefore, you're ultimately going to die. And so let's help you get on with it. And to do it, again, as I've been saying all along, for compassionate reasons. So as I say, okay, you want to talk about dignity, we don't have, our society, if you want to use the collective term, doesn't have an obligation to help you die with dignity, but we do have an obligation as individuals and collectively as society to help you live with dignity. And that's what our focus should be on, and that's the kind of language that we should be using in order to try to reverse some of these perverse, nonsensical, almost borderline evil uh, positions to take on some of these things.
Well, do you think it's kind of a trickle down or when Trudeau looked at that veteran a few years ago when he was on the campaign trail and the veteran was asking for assistance and he said, you're asking for more than Canada has to give. Then within a few weeks gave 250 or $300 million to some tin pot dictator halfway around the world. He had enough money to do that, but he couldn't help out our own. That kind of mentality, do you think that trickled down from the top and infected the people with that kind of mentality? We can't help you. It's inconvenient for us. You're right about the laziness because it's easier to dispose of somebody than it is to actually get off your butt and go and help them. From a logistical point of view. And I'm afraid that because of Trudeau's attitude about our military, about our elderly, about life in general, because he's still, relatively speaking, a young man. It's not like he's under threat of this. I think that leadership tends to set the tone for everybody that comes underneath them. And Veterans Affairs Canada is a branch of the government, and it's full of diplomats who have been there a long time, and they take their lead from the politicians that govern over them. And I think that might be part of the problem.
Well, it certainly doesn't help, but I think in this case that Justin Trudeau is largely a product of the society that he's governing now, rather than the creator of it, the instigator of
Okay,
it.
that's fair.
This is it, and again that is just, I think, emphasizes the magnitude of the problem that we have, is that it's a cultural thing, Nick. And look, you either believe that as a matter of as a philosophical premise okay, not as a scientific fact, but as a philosophical premise, an ideology, if you will. You either believe that human life is sacred or you don't. And if you don't believe in the sanctity of human life, and again, that's a philosophical premise that we bring to the debate. It's not a scientifically provable thing. Because if we're going to just apply science strictly, okay, then the utilitarian scientific position to take is, well, if it looks like they're beyond hope, end it now so that they're not wasting resources. And so this is, when people talk about you have to follow the science, well, okay, science, I think, has to inform us. But there are many things that science shouldn't be dictating to us. Well, science shouldn't be dictating anything to us. Because if we're going to allow science to dictate things to us, then there are many things that we're going to find that are really should be making us uncomfortable, and assisted suicide is one of them. So you have to start off with these premises, and I fear that we've lost so much of the moral capital that our society was constructed on because we haven't been replenishing it. We've completely rejected the foundational ideas of our society, which were, okay, I'm sorry to say it, well, I'm not sorry to say it, they were and are Judeo-Christian, okay?
Yes.
Now, and I'd make that assertion at the same time that I'm saying to you that you don't have to believe in God to accept that this is the foundation of our society. Okay? I'm not making a theological argument here. Yes, I'm a religious person. But I'd make the same argument if I was a raving lunatic atheist. The fact is that our society has certain foundational values. And you can't just toss them out without fundamentally altering the nature of what our society is. And we've become more and more utilitarian. And I think that part of the issue is, we're not going to get into a debate about the Enlightenment and all that stuff. I think that there were real philosophical problems with the Enlightenment, okay? But let's set that aside for a second, okay? I just think that we have in our society now, we've simply abandoned some of these values and in a rush to the idea of everything has to be rational, everything has to be reasonable. Well, okay, but this is the perfect subject, Nick, on the question of rationality, because the perfectly rational position to take is, yeah, assisted suicide sounds like a good idea. That's the rational, reasonable position to take, if reason is the only thing that you go by. But I don't go by just reason. I go by, as I say, we bring certain philosophical premises to the table. And one of them is, no matter how irrational it is, no matter how unreasonable it is, no matter how unscientific it is, human life is sacred, and we should be doing everything we can to preserve it and not shorten it. And we should not be facilitating people's desire to end their lives. And if they're suffering, okay, then our society's obligation, if people are suffering, is to solve the problems that are causing their suffering. If that means, look, we just spent billions of dollars, whether or not it was successful or not, developing vaccines for COVID. Well, why are we not putting the same kind of massive industrial government effort into solving, finding cures for other illnesses? I don't know.
Good question.
I can't answer that.
I'm going to leave you with the last word on that because there's one more topic we want to get into tonight. Today is a very important, in the greater scheme of things, world history, and that is it is December 7th. Now, December 7th was a major milestone in 1941. That is when Japan launched an attack across the Pacific. We all know what happened to the Americans at Pearl Harbor. and what, the consequences of that. Over 3,000 American servicemen died. It was a major blow to the U.S. Navy, and it was the launching of the war. That's what brought the Americans into World War II. It had already been going. Well, it depends on who you talk to, but most people accept the fact that World War II started in September of 39. So by the time the Americans ended the war was already at least 2 years old. So there's more to the story than that, though. One of the things that I wanted to point out is that Japan did not just attack Pearl Harbor. It attacked Ceylon, Hong Kong, a bunch of places across the Dutch East Indies. I think also were attacked at the same time, all on or about the same day. So this was a major military campaign by the Japanese, which set up their future successes and expanding their empire to include most, I won't say all by any stretch, but most of the Pacific, or at least a very big chunk of it. And it was their best chance to win. And they knew it, and they went after it, and it didn't go their way. But there's a story out of Ceylon. The Ceylon in World War II was a British naval base, kind of the British's version of Pearl Harbor. And they had a long-range Catalina flying boat, the Americans called them Sunderland, flying along, keeping an eye on things, captained by a guy by the name of Leonard Burchell, who is a Canadian. And he spotted the Japanese invasion task force, including aircraft carriers and all that stuff. They were coming to do the same thing to Ceylon they wanted to do they were doing to Pearl Harbor. So he spotted them, and he radioed back to Ceylon. The British fleet put to sea and turned back the Japanese invasion force and the carrier strike group. So Ceylon was spared the fate of Pearl Harbor. But the guy Leonard Burchell, was shot down by the Japanese, captured, and he spent 4 years in a Japanese internment camp. Now, there's a whole story about him that I do in Answer the Call, but let's just suffice to say he spent 4 brutal years at the hands of the Imperial Japanese Army and was beaten and tortured, and he was just a real, he went through hell. A lot of people who fell, and I don't mean to say that he was the only one. A lot of Allied prisoners of war in Japanese captivity went through hell. Now, he went on, he retired at age 89, I think. And he had 3 or 4 clasps to his CD, which means he'd been in service for like 67 years. The only person who had been given the honor more often than he had, because every few years you get another clasp on your medal, was the Queen Mother, the mother of Queen Elizabeth II. So he was a remarkable man, and Winston Churchill called him the savior of Ceylon, because if they'd taken Ceylon, who knows how that would have affected the outcome of the war. But because of one Canadian flying a Sunderland or Catalina flying boat in the British service, things could have been very, very different. So he's a real hero, and almost nobody knows about him, which is a pity.
Yeah, well, in Canada, almost nobody knows about this part of the history as well. And, we spend a lot of time talking about the European theater of operations during the Second World War, where most Canadian military activity took place. But
that's right.
We forget about the Japanese War and the Canadian battalion that was sent to defend Hong Kong after the Japanese
Winnipeg Rifles,
attacked Hong Kong and were forced to surrender on Christmas Day of 1941, and spent the rest of the war in captivity. The interesting thing about, I think, first of all, Nick, that you've you've illustrated, I think, a very important point, and that is that Pearl Harbor was one event, one aspect of a larger, massive Japanese campaign that commenced on that day, the
Right.
7th and the 8th, depending on where you were on the which side of the international date line that you were on. But
Right.
along with Pearl Harbor was the bombing of uh, Hong Kong, the bombing
Hmm.
of Singapore, the thwarted attack on Ceylon, bombing of Manila in the Philippines,
That's right.
and a number of other places. And here's a little known fact that I think is interesting to Canadians, and that is that, as it happens, Canada declared war on Japan after Pearl Harbor, before the Americans declared war on Japan.
Now that
So
I didn't know.
yeah, it's a little known little factoid, but of course, the reason that Canada declared war was not because the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor, although that may have been enough if that had just been the only thing. But of course, the
It was the
Canada
attack
was
on
an
Hong Kong.
ally of England at the time, obviously, the United Kingdom. We had been fighting, our troops had been fighting in World War II for more than 3 years now by the time this happened, 3 years and 4 months. And and so when the Japanese attacked British possessions in the Far East, Hong Kong being one,
That's
Singapore
right.
being another one, and some other places, they at virtually the same time that the British government declared war on Japan, the Canadian government declared war on Japan as well. So it wasn't automatic like in the First World War. The Canadian government did have to declare war,
Yeah.
as we talked last week about the Statute of Westminster. That was one of the outcomes of the Statute of Westminster, was that the British government, the Parliament in the UK, could no longer declare war on behalf of its dominions, of one
Right.
of which was Canada. So so yeah, one of those little known facts, but it's unfortunate. I don't think that Canadians have a very good understanding of the contribution that this country made to the war in general, and I'm including in Europe, where, as I said, most of the operations were, certainly virtually all of the land operations. Then there was the Battle of the Atlantic, which was a very significant contribution that Canadians made in the Battle of the
Yeah.
Atlantic. And then at the bottom of the pile that nobody seems to know about is the Canadian involvement in the war against Japan.
Well,
And
there is.
I really wish that we did spend a little bit more time talking about our military history. And it's not to aggrandize, war or anything like that. It's because it shaped the world that we live in now. And somebody, there's an old saying that you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've come from. But I came across a similar statement that I thought was far more effective and far more, I think, profound than that. And that is that you don't know where you are in the present. If you can't understand the present if you don't understand the past.
That's very true. Now,
And
I
I'm
will add one more little fact to this.
sure.
Uh, the Pacific Theater is also the last, is where Canada won its last Victoria Cross. Hampton Gray attacked towards the very end of the war, attacked a Japanese destroyer in his F4 Corsair, the Gull Wingbird, and dropped a bomb on it, sank it, but was killed in the process. He crashed on the far side. They never did find his plane or his body. And in the 1980s, I think, both the Canadian and the Japanese government recognized his bravery with a memorial near the site of where his plane was lost, and his attack took place. So there is a lot of history that that Canadians simply don't know about. They don't know anything about Hampton Gray. They don't know anything about, like, if you asked how many Canadian Victoria Cross winners can you name, they might get Smokey Smith, which would be about it. You know, Paul Triquet, Hampton Gray, different people like that. They would have no clue. There was Lieutenant Flowerdew in the First World War, led one of the last cavalry charges in history, was shot through both thighs, continued to urge his men on to overrun a German machine gun company, and died of his wounds the following day, but he won the Victoria Cross. And I could go on and on and on. But there's just our military history, and you're right, we're not trying to glorify war. People often ask me, why are you so fascinated with military history? And my answer is, first of all, it makes all the rest of the history possible. The other thing is that it brings out the very best and the very worst in people. You've got the extremes and everything in between. You see great acts of kindness between enemies and great acts of brutality as well. Sometimes it just, it's such a cacophony of strains on the human soul that when you study it, you see everything that's good and bad about humanity. And that's why I'm interested in it. Not because I'm bodies being all that stuff, or it's so fascinating to try to understand the mind of man. And the best way to do it, I think, is in times of conflict, because that's when he's under the greatest amount of stress. And that's when character, or a lack of it, rise to the surface.
You know, I've watched a couple of times the miniseries Band of Brothers.
Mm-hmm.
That follows the exploits of the one of the
Easy Company,
Easy
101st
Company
Airborne.
in the 506th, I think, Airborne Division.
Was it 506? That was
During the Second
101st.
World War, and I think it's a very well done series.
It absolutely is.
But it brings to mind a very important question for me, and that is why we haven't done the same thing here to demonstrate to people what our citizens did in Europe during that time. The liberation of Holland, for instance, in Belgium, the landings at D-Day. Everybody knows about the Omaha Beach and Utah Beach and the Americans, etc. But how many people know about the Canadians who landed in Normandy and what they did on D-Day?
Have you seen the movie The Forgotten Battle?
I've not. No.
That's a movie set in Holland featuring the Canadian Army. Now, it's not a war movie. It's not about two armies competing against each other. It's about a Dutch family trying to survive the Battle of the Scheldt. And you see in the midst of it all.
It's on Netflix, right?
Yeah, it is. Absolutely. I highly recommend you go and watch it. So there have been, in the last little while, some effort. I would love to see. Passchendaele was a complete waste of time. I didn't like that movie at all.
Awful movie.
Yeah, it is. No question. But I would like to see a movie called Haida. As a matter of fact, I talked to a historian when I was still on terrestrial radio about making the movie about HMCS Haida, which is now permanently berthed in Hamilton as the last surviving tribal class destroyer, and what it did during World War II under Captain Harry DeWolf, which is the namesake. He now has a ship class named after him. He was one of our most incredible sailors, a very kind, gentle man. But when it came time to do his job, there was nobody better. And there's a whole, I won't go into the details because we don't have the time, but read Haida's story. I was really hoping we could get a movie up and running, but there just wasn't any money for it. I went to parliamentarians and I went to all kinds of people. No interest. It's not Hollywood, and you're never going to get anybody out of Hollywood to want to do it. The closest we got was Greyhound, where they mentioned Sackville, called it, I forget what his code name was, Dickie. Yes. They CG'd it into the battle as a fringe kind of thing. So anyway, looking at the clock, I guess we are running out of time. which means it has been another fast-paced and an interesting show. I want to thank everybody in the chat room and all you listening
Nick,
out there in internet land.
And Nick, let me interject as we're wrapping up to remind people that they can go to our webpage, thenickandjoeshow.com, where they can listen to this show and past shows as podcasts. And while you're there, you can buy us a cup of coffee.
Yeah, that would be cool. We like coffee.
Yes.
All right.
Help
With that
us
said,
keep the show free.
That's how we do it. All right. With that said, I'm going to wish you all a good night. We'll see you all again next week. In the meantime, ubi caritas et amor, Deus ibi est. Good evening, God bless. Don't let anything disturb your peace, and may you have a fair wind in a following sea.